So let us begin by being present to our breath. Again, notice your breath. Breath is that which comes and goes through the nostrils. Notice that when you're present to it, it goes through different changes, actually. Becomes finer. Maybe you become aware of the vibration within it. Which is like a magnetism. You know, when I was a boy, I told you I lived in the country, and we had a barn. Between the house and the barn there was a pond. And I was walking to the barn one day, I was probably about 9, and I felt something tug me right at the back of the neck, just like something grabbed me. And I turned around, and the pond was probably about as far away as that far wall from me. And in the pond was an old water moccasin snake. Old because she was white, so old. And she was going like this. I could feel that far away. And that is not because I was so sensitive. It was because the snake was so strong in her breath. And I thought, like if I was a little frog, she would bring me closer. But I said to her, "Oh, I'm too big for you." I was big and brave at 8. But I didn't really think she wanted to eat me. She was trying to say something. So if a snake can have such a breath, perhaps you too. I have another story. I have lots of stories. One time I used to work at Boston Children's Hospital, of all places, and I was able to go to many different lectures that were offered to the people who worked there. And I went to one of Herbert Benson's first lectures. He was a researcher at Harvard Medical, which was affiliated. And he had taught a mouse, he was interested in biofeedback, and he had taught a mouse to blush in its left ear and not in its right. A little mouse. And this was the beginning of mind-body. We didn't call it then, we called it psychosomatic medicine, but we were just beginning to understand something about these things. Anyway, for some strange reason, it was just men in the room. I don't know why. You know, those days, doctors, whatever. But anyway, I remember him saying, come closer and look at the mouse. And I did. I came up and looked at the mouse. Sure enough, little left ear was bright red. Little right ear was kind of mousy gray. And I didn't know what to be more amazed of, the fact that the mouse could do this, or that it was so fearless and it could do it in front of a whole crowd. I could hardly speak in front of a crowd. And here the mouse is making one ear red and that. All I remember from that lecture, besides how brave that mouse was Benson's voice booming over my head. Am I looking at the mouse? And he goes, "Gentlemen, if a mouse can do it, so can you." Well, and if a snake can do it, so could you. The breath is an amazing faculty. Okay, I wanted to say something about knowing, and then we'll do a practice. Knowing from the heart. You know, the practice of the Sufi, I said earlier, was zikr. It means to remember. Remember. And it was actually Socrates who said, knowing is an act of remembrance. So what did he mean by that? I can't tell you how many times I have been with people, and I would say something, and they would nod their head yes. And then they would say later to me, I always knew that, I always felt that way, but no one ever said it like that. So when you said it like that, I recognized, yes, I understand, I know. It's true. And that is, they remembered. They remembered. They knew. They just forgot. Someone said it in a way, and they said, yes, that's true. I always, now that you say that, that's true. I know that. I've always known that. Some will even say, ever since I was 8 or 9, I knew this. When I was a little boy or girl, I knew these things. I didn't really, no one said it like this, but yeah, I knew. I knew what everybody else was saying. They were missing something, because I knew there was something that they were not talking about. And that is the knowing of the heart. It's like an aha. Yes. Yes, that's true. I know that. And I am very thankful for modern science, because modern science gives me the possibility of living a paradoxical life and feeling quite comfortable with that. So we know, for example, that light is a particle and a wave at the same time, and no one has any problem with that, I guess. So if they had any problem, it would make any difference. But we get all caught up in well, it's got to be this way or it's got to be that way. And but it doesn't necessarily. It could be both. Life is often an and. So on one hand, we've always known something, but on the other hand, Ibn Arabi's there tapping us on the shoulder and saying, yes, but who's the you that exists now? That was the you that existed then. And what do you know now? Because now you're looking from a different vantage point. So you're going to see something differently. For example, near where I live, there's a mountain called Mount Minchell. It's one of the highest mountains on the East Coast, if not the highest. The East Coast doesn't have much to brag about in terms of height, because it's old. But anyway, Mount Mitchell does exist. It's still proud and tall, relatively speaking. If you go up Mount Mitchell on the north side, halfway up and look, you see one thing. If you go all the way to the top, you see something else. If you go down the east side, look halfway, you see something different. You go down the south side to the base. What is the right thing that you see? Well, they're all right. They're just different because you're looking from different vantage points. So you're going to see different things. Those vantage points is what the Sufis call maqam, the station. And the station is the way you know things now, what you have settled in for now. Maqam also means a tavern. So Sufis like to use everyday words for great mystical experiences. A tavern, of course they were Bedouins, so they would go to a place to be refreshed. It could be an oasis. They're in the desert, they finally come to a place to refresh for a time, and then they move on again in their pilgrimage. And that refreshment is a maqam. So our way of knowing, that which we see, that which we know, is based on our maqam, and it also is our maqam. Both. Somehow there can be a breakthrough. A breakthrough. They call that a kash, an opening, a finding, a fatah. And that might come through you're doing a spiritual practice once or for 10 years. So, and then there's a breakthrough. Or it might come just because you're walking down the street and the universe decides to give you a breakthrough. Or it is, you see things differently now because now you're a different being. Imagine the woman who didn't identify herself as a person of power and then allowed her spirit, her soul to rise up and endow her with power. How is she going to see the world now? See, that's what I mean by a new makam. And Ibn al-Arabi would say that new knowing is now your veil. It's now the veil. The play researchers would say it's where you've settled for now. It's where you've settled for now. It's like a bird on a branch. So I wanted to say those things so that it wasn't just, we just think, I've always known these things, and it's just a question of getting back to what once was. But it's more than that. There are two modes of light in the word kash, K-A-S-H-F, kash. Means to cast the light of your soul upon something, the light of your consciousness. The soul focuses its light through your consciousness, like a crystal, upon something. And there's two dynamics about that. One is like going into a dark room with a flashlight. And you look around and you see things. Those things have always been there. You just didn't cast your light upon them. That, to some extent, is what science has employed for 100 years or so, Western science. The other dynamic of Kash is evocative, creative. And it would be that it is, you cast your light upon something and it ignites that which would only be a latent potentiality if you had not done that. And the modern example of that would be the understanding, in quantum physics at least, that the consciousness of the experimenter to some extent affects the outcome of the experiment. In other words, you're not just unveiling something that was always eternally there, but because of your conscious interfacing, it actually evokes something, ignites something into the potentiality into manifestation that wouldn't have been ignited otherwise. So when we are casting the light of our consciousness even upon our own heart, these two things occur. One, we can see what is there, waiting for us to look. Two, we can evoke that which would only be a latent potentiality until we do look. So what does that mean? Besides just poetics. Again, using this person who was feeling anxious, well, that was a veil. It was a veil that was caused by resistance and also refusal. Refusal. But when she looked, she could see something there beyond the veil that was just waiting for her to bear witness. The word is witness, shahid, to bear witness about her own being, that it was seeking to actually blossom as her. And should it blossom as her, then she has now evoked what I would call a new ecology of being. That being is changed. Now, you can no longer say, I do not experience myself as power, can say, I experience myself as power. Now I have a whole new set of concerns about appropriate relationships with the rest of life, because I'm a new being. So that is what's called transformational process. That's an aspect of, in Sufism, we are always open to allowing our being to most fully manifest. Our being, not our ego. Not our ego in the normal sense of the word. There is a different ego. It's called Nafs Salim, which means peaceful ego. That is the end result of ego transformation in Sufi practice. I have to tell you, it's not a secret necessarily, but what is it called? Confession. And that is, when I teach, I don't come with a program. I know there's a program, but I just start speaking. And I'm afraid it may come out like scrambled eggs. I'm never really quite sure why I just said what I said. But I believe in that process because I've been doing it for 40 years and people seem to get something out of it, more than if I have a very deliberate speech. I look inside to see what's the next thing. There was a time when I lived in Boston, and Sri Chamoy, who was the chaplain at the United Nations at the time, a great Hindu, I don't know if he was considered himself a Swami or what, but he was a very great soul. And they said he's giving darshan at the armory. So, of course, I wanted to get darshan too. So I came. And darshan, I wasn't sure what darshan was, but I wanted it. It was something. It was like candy. The great soul would look at you, he would smile, and he might say something, or not. Pure Vilayat would look at you and tell stories. But anyway, so I went to get the darshan. And there was probably 300 people in line. I said, oh, I will never get the darshan. Not with 300 people. Plus I felt sorry for the poor guy. So there were bleachers, and so I thought, well, I will sit here and watch. I will watch him give darshan. Because after all, I don't know what darshan is. And so I'm looking, and it was very strange because I thought it was a glance of light. But he never looked at the person. He was like this, and they would come in front of him, and they do a namaste, and they go. And I'm thinking, what is he doing? How can he be doing a glance of light? He's not even looking at them. And then a thought came to me. What is he looking at? And I watched, and I said, he's looking at his heart. He's seeing them in the mirror of his heart. And he's bowing there. And that is his darshan. Why do I even tell that story? I think I know I'm telling that story. So, if you look at a little child, 2, 3, 4 years old, before anybody hurts them or anything, how do they stand? They stand like this. Just like the puppies stand. You say it's innocent. But what is going on? Their face is open. Their face is open. And their heart is open. And their face shows their heart. What is in their heart is in their face. You see that in a 3-year-old, 4-year-old. Come sometime look. you will see their heart looking into their face. Or you'll see their heart looking at you through their face. Now, if they've been hurt, you will see clouds go across that mirror through their face. But that is also true for adults, believe it or not just 3-year-olds. You can also look into the faces of an adult and see their heart as well. It's just good practice to look at a 3-year-old first. Less complicated. Jalaluddin Rumi said, this heart is like a mirror. And it gets rusty. And it needs to be cleansed. And he said the wazifa, the divine name, and the zikr is the soap and water that we use to wash the heart clean. So we're going to do that. So the zikr we're going to use today, because we're talking about the heart so much, is Ishq Allah Ma'abud Allah. Now let me say something about Ishq. The word means ardent desire. Ardent desire. The Sufi would say, Ishq is what brought you to manifestation. Ishq is what brought you to the womb of your mother at a certain time. Ishq is what kept you in the womb of your mother for a certain time. Ishq is what drew you forth from the womb of your mother at a certain time. Ishq is what has drawn you throughout your sacred pilgrimage to this very moment. This great desire. So Ishq Allah means God is love, just like St. John said, God is love. Ishq Allah Ma'abud Allah. And God is the one who is loved and the one who is loving. So it's the trilogy of love. So we'll say it, and it's a ritual, it's a formula, but where we make it not a formula is by bringing our presence to it and relating to it, each in our own way. So this starts off the left shoulder, Ishq, and it goes across, the head goes across the solar plexus, Ishq Allah, up over the right shoulder, up above the crown, Ma'abud, down into the solar plexus. The solar plexus is where we hold our form. And remember earlier today I said life is disturbing. You may not remember, but now you do. Life is disturbing. So yes, the Ma'abud in the solar plexus disturbs the form. Disturbs it. So you can let go. As they say in AAA, let go and let God. Ma'abud and then Allah. Like the doctor says, say ah. My doctor doesn't say that anymore, but when I was a kid, they say ah. You put your hand up here and say ah for a second. Ah. 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 La. Do you feel any vibration in there? That's a good sign. Means you're alive. Allah. That's that sound there, all right? So here we go. And then when you say it, you go, Ish Allah Ma'abu Allah. Then you breathe in with your nose, like we've been practicing earlier, into your heart. And you can breathe out, you don't have to hold it, but you stay present for a moment to see what is there. You've been evoking something, now what is there? Each time, after you say the word, recitation, you pause, breathe, present. Ish Allah. Ma'abu Allah. 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 Amen. We're going to do it again in a minute, but I just wanted to say a couple of words. So when you look inside, you might feel different things. Maybe tenderness, maybe sore, pain, pressure, maybe something pushing upon you, asking for more space in your heart for it. Let's continue. Ish Allah. Ma'abu Allah. Ish Allah. Ma'abu Allah. Ish Allah. Ma'abu Allah. Ish Allah. Ma'abu Allah. One more time. Ish Allah. Ma'abu Allah. Be present to your heart. Notice its condition. Amen. Now I noticed earlier that Swamiji did a practice. He ended on an odd number. The Sufis also end on an odd number. Hazrat Khan said, you end on an odd number like 7, 11, 33, 99, 101, because then it moves forward seeking completion. If you ended on an even number, it would be complete and it would stop. So we end on an odd number to keep the practice moving forward. But true zikr is not the formula. Perhaps you can feel your heart dancing around, vibrating, more alive, with something, something in it, present to you through it. I want to tell you a story about a goose. I had a goose. His name was Nicholas. He was about this tall. At the time I had Nicholas, my younger daughter was about that tall as well. Nicholas had a bad habit. He would hiss. He would go sss with his beak out. Sss. And it made you feel like maybe he wants to attack me or bite me. And my daughter, when she'd go to school, she'd look out the door both ways, see if Nicholas, she'd run for the car and slam the door. And Nicholas, he treated our house like the Kaaba. He would circumambulate it every day with his one eye looking through the windows to see anything interesting, anything alive, moving. And then he would hiss at me when I'd come out. I don't want to offend anybody, particularly Swamiji, but I will have to say, at one point I said to Nicholas, Nicholas, Christmas is coming. It was a bit of a warning. Some people have a tradition, roast goose. So one day, this old farmer came, and Nicholas did his thing, my guard goose. He came up and he was hissing at the farmer, and the farmer said, "Oh, you want some sugar?" And he sat down on the ground. Sugar in the mountains of North Carolina means love. So, you want some sugar? I thought, oh, Nicholas is going to attack my neighbor, you know. He's going to, this poor guy. But darn, if Nicholas didn't bow and climb into his lap, and he bowed his neck, and the man is petting him. And Nicholas is just lying there, being petted. There goes my guard goose. And I said, Nicholas. I mean, it astounded me. I just got it. I said, poor social skills. All this time, you were asking for sugar. And we thought you wanted to attack us. That's a true story, by the way. After that, when Nicholas would come and hiss, I'd say, oh, you want some sugar? He'd bow his neck, and I would pet him. And then he would grab if he, you know, he didn't ever get enough sugar. He'd grab your leg and pull. And he'd even go up to the dogs and preen them, and they really did not like that at all. I won't bore you with the rest of the story because it's not so great. But anyway, the bottom line is Nicholas reminded me of a few people I knew. I'm sorry. But you learn so much from these animals. They're so transparent, you know, compared to people sometimes. Okay, so where does this lead us besides a funny story about Nicholas the goose who wanted sugar and hissed for it? Well, we're going to do a practice. So I want you to think of a situation in your life that was somewhat difficult with another person. You weren't being difficult, they were being difficult. If you don't have any situation like that, make one up. But I suspect, looking at the general average age here, there's a few situations in everyone's life that we could think of. Where if you had someone videoing the conversation, all of your friends would agree this other person was attacking you. Okay? So once you get that memory, then just sit it on the shelf for a moment, just because you're going to come back to it. But just put it there on the shelf. And now let us go back into our hearts. And I want you to do the practice we did earlier today. So first, just be present to your breath. And it isn't that you're going to do anything to your breath. It is that you let your breath do something to you. You watch your breath. Let your breath teach you. And when you reach a place where your breath is very fine and vibrant, then breathe behind the sternum into this spot, Latifa Syria. Massage it with the breath, caress it with the breath, illumine it with the breath. You breathe in and breathe out. And again, there are different stages. One might be almost the imaginal, like maybe I'm feeling a sort of a neuroplexy or a chakra there, maybe I'm not. But then you touch it a little more with the breath and you say, yes, that's right, I can feel it more clearly now. It calls to me. So breathe on that spot. And then it intensifies. That's a felt shift. Then there's some warmth. And softening. Then you allow the witness, the perceiver, to descend into the heart and to look around from the vantage point of the heart. And you notice that the chest cavity seems larger than usual. And as you're present to that space, it develops, it unfurls, expands to beyond your physicality. A vast, boundless space of the heart, filled with God's secrets. Allow yourself to bathe in this sacred ocean. It's like lying in the arms of the beloved. Now, from this vantage point, take that memory and look at it again. The problematic memory from that other person causing those problems. Now, from the eye of the heart, look at that situation and see if you see it any differently. See if there's any new information. There might not be. You might see it exactly the same. But I suspect there could be. And then staying in that vast heart space. Open your eyes, and stay there, and just notice, in fact, that the objects of the outer world do pull you out from the inner world, but you can negotiate that peace. The presence and breath, you can stay. The vastness of the heart can be just as present to you as everybody in the room. So I have a question, now that your eyes are open. How many, it's just a raising of hands, there doesn't have to be any personal testimonials. So, how many people got some different information when they looked at the situation from the vantage point of the heart? New information. Okay? Those of you who didn't, just keep working. Keep trying. I guarantee you will find some new information sooner or later, because you'll be looking at it from a radically different perspective. Hazrat Khan said, I only have one thing to offer you. Only one thing. And that is a perspective. But if anyone's read all of his books, you'd say, wow, it's a heck of a perspective. It's like, it covers the territory. But this is, the Sufi says that they are on the path of the heart. The Sufi lays claim to that. You can see it as a subtitle in many Sufi books, The Path of the Heart. Some Sufis lay claim to it. If it is true, then your heart is your path. Your heart is your compass. I mean, not just as a fancy idea, but as a practice, moment by moment practice. There is a Sufi saying that Hazrat Khan tells about, and it goes, watch every breath that you take and be aware of every step that you make. And I would add to it, and include your heart. So it's and include your heart. Hazrat Khan also says, Sufism begins life in the heart. And it culminates our life in the soul. So all these practices, all these rituals, all these teachings, that's what they are, as rituals, practices, and teachings. Then there is living in the heart. Using the heart as your compass. Using the heart as your light. Using your heart as your path. Which then, he says, culminates in you living in the soul. So I've tried to make this about as practical as I can, calling it a compass, like a real compass, showing you how you can just check in anytime you wish to see how are you going north or south? Is there any heart in this discussion? Or is it somewhere, are you discussing from a different vantage point? Now, years ago, I used to be involved with a healing order. And this was my primary practice that I shared with people. In fact, this has been my primary practice, period, no matter what order I've been part of for over 4 decades. But when I first shared it with people in the healing work to be healers, which was, I don't know when, 1980, they would raise their hand and say, but Himayat, if our heart is open, then we're going to be vulnerable to all the negative impressions of life. And it's true. Hazrat Khan does talk about impressions. But in the Quran it says, the whole universe is not large enough to hold my face, but the heart of the human is. That means that the heart is bigger than the whole universe. I mean, now I'm applying logic to the voice of God. So, if the heart is bigger than the whole universe, it is not just a doormat. Think of the power inherent in such a faculty. The power. In fact, the heart is the cauldron of the true alchemist. The heart is able to turn the dross of life into gold. Now, that would just sound like poetry, except I just showed you how. So it's not just poetry. I showed you, maybe you didn't get much out of it, but I showed you. Okay, you got a bad problem with somebody? That's what I call the dross of life. You know, go into your heart, look at it. You might see it differently. You might get more information. Now, I want to say one more thing about this, just to make it as sensible as possible. It's what I'm always trying to do, make the subtle sensible. Like this chair is sensible. Most people, the soul is not sensible, or the heart is not sensible. I try to make the subtle sensible. That's my job, I think. So that's why I tell stories about geese. So, let's just think about it for a moment. We develop as human beings by a process that modern psychology calls individuation. And in that process, we make lots of choices. And life gets narrowed by the choices we make. At first, anything's possible. When you're an adolescent, a young person, you could do anything, theoretically. You might not feel that way, but theoretically you could. Sooner or later, you might have 4 or 5 choices, and you think you're going to choose one of them, but 5 or 10 or 15 years later, you find out that in fact you chose none of them, that life chose you to do something else. Just bumped up against you and said, hey, here's something for you to do. But nevertheless, you think you're making choices. And as you make choices, or even you choose to say to life, okay, I'll do this, you're narrowing your focus. And in our world, we've narrowed it down to subspecialization. You know, we get really narrowed down. That's the end point of individuation. And at some point in the process of individuation, you become an autonomous human being, fully functional. So you can drive a car, you got a job, you got a house, you got a bank account maybe. You know, you can pay your bills, you elect the next president, we hope. Whatever, you're functional. And at some point you say, is this all there is to be functional? And the Sufis call that the great turn, the beginning of the great turn. Is this all there is? And then we go into what we would call post-individuation, or into what modern psychologists might call the transpersonal realm, or toward that which the ancient ones would call union, unity consciousness. So that's our path, that's our trajectory. But often we get caught up with our historical self. Ibn Arabi says that in each instant we're born afresh. And he doesn't say this precisely, but he does say, and you know it not because you're caught in the prison of time and space. But I would say you're also caught in the prison of your habits and your memories, which I earlier said already are hardwired into your flesh. When you go to the mirror in the morning, you don't want to see change unless it looks better than it did yesterday. You're resistant to change. You want to see a face that you recognize. You don't want to see a brand new creature there looking at you. There was a great Sufi named Al-Tustari. He talks about 2 egos, that we have 2 egos. One ego he calls the natural ego. And that is the ego that I call the historical identity. That is the ego that's developed through the process, organic process of having a physical body, a mind, and individuating as a human being. And it's a natural ego, nafs, N-A-F-S. And then he says there's a spiritual ego. That is, the natural ego is bound to this earth. The spiritual ego is bound to eternity. But we have both egos. And he says these egos can be integrated through zikr, through remembrance, like the zikr we just did. And then they need to be integrated. But what I wanted to say about this, without getting too difficult at this late time of the day, is the reason that when we go into the domain of the heart, we get to a place, we say it's boundless. We have now entered into transcendence. Most people think of transcendence as just vertical. But I think of transcendence as eluding 3-dimensionality, no matter how you do it. Eluding time and space, the constraints of time and space. Transcending time and space. If you go into a boundless space that traverses time and space but is not of it, you now transcended. But you also whoever you may be, are not any longer primarily rooted in your historical identity. You now are in what we could call an ahistorical identity. An ahistorical identity. One that has no birth and no death. It is not rooted in history as we understand it. Now you are experiencing freedom from the drag of your habits, your behaviors, your history. When you are in your historical self, the natural nafs doing its job is to make sure you survive. And it's doing its job well. You're all still here. So the natural nafs is doing its job when you're in your historical self to survive. When you are in your ahistorical self, survival is a non-issue. Doesn't make any sense. Therefore, no need for defense structures, psychological defense. There's nothing to defend. That is why, from that perspective, you can look at the situations that you look at in your historical, through your historical self, and see them quite differently. Get different information because your survival isn't at stake. When Nicholas is opening his mouth and hissing, I think either his survival or my survival is at stake. Until I realize that he's not really wanting to kill me, he wants me to love him. But until that moment of realization occurs, there's some question as to who's going to make it through this. When you have an encounter with your boss or somebody, or your spouse or your ex-spouse, it might be kind of like a Nicholas encounter. And you may feel like your survival is at stake. I have to defend myself. I have to protect myself. I have to survive. And of course you do. And your natural nafs is doing its job. And you're going to see things from the perspective of the desire to survive. Looking from your ahistorical self, survival is a non-issue. So I suspect, well, I should say more than I know, that you will see things differently. You'll get different kinds of information. We can employ this particular vantage not just to other people, all those cretins who are always attacking us. We can employ it to ourselves. We can employ this vantage point to looking at our own historical structures. I know that this is true because I've seen it done, and I've done it myself hundreds of times. It isn't done in an hour's workshop, but it can be done. And it is a very transformative possibility. A true transformative possibility. So this is what I mean by the path of the heart. The eye of the heart, the ear of the heart, living in the heart, walking in life on the path of the heart. The heart is a true compass. And also remembrance. There's a lot of words, particularly after lunch. Everybody looks like they're ready to pass out. Any comments or questions before we continue? Yeah. Well, yeah, knobs are responsible for the veils. You know, when we look at the veils, the first thing I would say is God bless the veils, because that's, like I already said, without shadow, there would be no perception. There's a saying in the Quran that you're not prepared to see my full face. You would be incinerated by its luminosity. So we go step by step with an interplay of shadow and light. So the veils are wondrous scaffolding. They're not something to be despised, rather embraced. And we could say the same about the knobs. I will say that I've had the honor of watching some people pass, including my own spiritual teacher. And I could see a discussion between those two knobs. In each case, the physical body wants to live. The soul wants to go. They have a discussion. That discussion can be 5 minutes long or 5 weeks long. It is between the two of them to decide. But there is a discussion, and you can see the nafs of both. You can see the soul wishing, longing, moving, and you know the soul's going to win. It's just a question of how are we going to do this? You can also see the physical body saying, I'm not talking about the mind of the person. I'm talking about the physical body. I want to live. And so there's a discussion. It can be a very graceful discussion, very compassionate discussion, or it can be an argument that eventually turns into a graceful discussion. But there will be a discussion. You can see the two nafs at work when the person is getting ready to move on. And both nafs are blessed. It isn't that one is blessed and the other is cursed. There's a phrase in Sufism called nafs al-amara, and it means means many different things. Sometimes they call it the animal ego, the instinctual ego, or the natural ego. We want the nafs al-amara. Whether you want it or not, it's immaterial. You're going to have it no matter what. But you're not going to ever get rid of your nafs al-amara. Not really. But you do want your nafs al-amara. You want to stay alive. You want to be functional. You want to have an identity while you're a human being. You want to be a human being. There'll be time enough to be an angel. There are other ego structures as well, though, as well as nafs al-amara, that take place and are developed over transformational process. We want those too. All the way up to what's called nafs salim, or the peaceful ego, or the spiritual ego. So from my perspective, the shadows, yes, they're part of the veiling. There's light also in the veiling, both shadows and light. Both are alluring. Sometimes they're scary and alluring. You wanted to say something? You come up with some amazing questions. The consequence would be 2008. Remember 2008? You don't remember 2008? The big crash? The big crash? And boy, you guys had a privileged life. I remember the big crash, barely digging out from it. What caused that big crash? Imagination, logic, mathematics, with no moral grounding, no reality. Hyperinflated mortgages that didn't have any real value. That's what caused 2008. So you want to know what our life would be like with the intellect only operating on 2 cylinders instead of 3? 2008 is a good example. Creativity is not enough if we don't have a moral grounding. No heart, no reality. We can be as creative as we want to be, but if there's no reality to it, it's going to be a problem. I like having those little factoids, you know, 2000. Oh, but I hear you. I don't take it. Well, first I want to say something about this word intellect, because I already my definition of intellect and yours is a little different. I defined it, the very first thing this morning is having 3 subcomponents. 1, the rational mind. 2, the faculty of creative imagination. 3, the heart. That which knows, that which is in touch, direct perception with reality. And I said, I used the word pencil. That is what the mind can come up with. That's called representation, but it's not direct relationship with reality, it's indirect relationship with reality. It's a representation. It's not reality. The reality is the pencil in your hand. It's present. The heart is the faculty that is present to reality. Creative imagination, the faculty of creative imagination, is what's called the meeting place, where the information from this world, the information from the more subtle worlds meet, and in that meeting, new form emerges. Information, dialogue, creation. The rational, which has an absolutely sacred function. Its function is representation of reality. But it is not direct perception. So that's my definition of the intellect. The intellect for me is all three, not just one. And I would still insist that we need to have our work and our thought and our creativity to be truly authentic needs to be somewhat grounded in reality. That's what I would say. And for me, that is not necessarily nebulous. It can be nebulous, but then it would be like saying authentic action is nebulous. It's like reality is not like a doorbell goes off and now we've arrived at reality. Reality is a paradox. Reality is an ever receding horizon, and yet reality is perceptible, and it can send us information. I wanted to say something, but I just had a senior moment. So from my perspective, authenticity. So from my perspective, when I'm acting from my authentic self, my actions reflect my deepest sensitivities of spiritual truth. However deep those sensitivities are. However sensible they are to me. And they keep changing, obviously. I've already said we keep changing incessantly. But at some level, I need to touch in to my deepest ideal and find it inside my heart. And from there, I act. And that action, I would call authentic action. It's authentic because it represents my truth. Yeah. Excuse me? It could be. Somebody here wanted to say something. Yes.
With your vein of discussion, but I think what business or what pure intellect or pure capitalism is that human element, the passion, the care, the love that we need to have for ourselves as well as for everyone else. And in a pure logical sense, for instance, it would make no sense to keep people alive who are not well enough to survive on their own. Yet we do that because we have compassion. Logic would say, oh, that's a waste of resources. And I'm afraid if we get to a world like that where we hear that rhetoric oftentimes being thrown out, or, well, let's get all those people out of the country because they're here illegally. How can anybody be anywhere illegally? That's a strange concept, really. It's only an intellectual and a capitalist concept. It's not one that comes from the heart. And what I hear you saying is that we put these together as an authentic sense. It's not just the thinking part of it, but it's the emotional and it's the ultimate sense of what our responsibility is for everything.
And I would redefine again, from my perspective, the word intellect as well. I would broaden it to include more than just the rational. So it's a question of orientation. If we can orient ourselves to include more of ourselves, and then we, I think, have a better chance of being effective. Because we're bringing more resources to bear. That's the other thing I want to say in conclusion about this, and we're going to take a break and then come back and we can still converse. Felt resource, yes. I won't say most of us, human beings, when we are caught up in our historical identity, it becomes ever more limited, and we become very aware of our limitations and our insufficiencies. And actually, in truth, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that is not a judgment on my part. Because in truth, from the Sufi perspective, all of us must be insufficient. Because ultimately there's only one thing that is sufficient, and that's God. Everything is insufficient in relationship to God. It is our insufficiencies that draw us to God. They don't make us into little creatures. It's our insufficiencies that draw us to God. They draw us to be fulfilled with that which is all sufficient. But we can get caught up in the shadow of insufficiency, feeling insufficient, feeling small, feeling limited, feeling beset and buffeted, feeling poor, impoverished, feeling like we have no felt resource. Now, I'm not talking about New Age aphorisms, I'm talking about felt resource, sensible. You can feel the resource. You don't keep saying, I am resourced, I am resourced. You feel the resource. This practice of the heart, when you consider it carefully, you can see that it leads you to what the Buddhists would call a place of refuge. Felt resource that lies within each one of us. It is not outside of us, it's within us. But we don't feel it. We don't know it. But once we know that, truly know that, and feel that, and can access that, we have a divine treasury. We have a divine treasury. We have unlimited resource. And it isn't just an idea. It's an experience. But that does not mean that you're going to get the parking spot you want. That doesn't mean you're going to get a Ferrari. But it is going to mean that you're going to experience within yourself tremendous resource. I had a man come to me once, many years ago, in Florida, Naples, Florida. I was giving a workshop and he came to me. He was a man who had met 4 different kings and 4 different presidents of the United States. He was extremely wealthy. He had 2 Lamborghinis in his garage, which he showed me, $650,000 each. Why he needed 2, I don't know. Why he even needed 1, I don't know. He had 3 houses in Naples. One was filled with marble statuary. One of them had a closet in the bedroom that was almost as long as this room, and it was filled with silk shirts and pants and shoes. Why would such a man come to me? He said, I am filled with the deepest anxiety. He was from Morocco. He said, my mother was a Sufi. I think she could have saved me. I'm wondering if you can. This is a true story. I said, well, why don't you come to where I live in the mountains? I lead people on personal retreat, which I do. A retreat means that you go into a small house and it isn't just 5 hours. It could be 5 days or 10 days. And we do practices, and in those days I might even offer healing. He said, can I bring my friend? I said, no. Can I bring my dog? I said, no. He said, well, what do I do all day? I said, well, you do practices and I will come and be with you from time to time. He said, I cannot do that. I said, why not? I would be too anxious. So here's a man with all these resources that most people couldn't even dream of. But he has no real resource that he feels. None. And he comes to a man who does not have a Lamborghini. I drive an Echo, an old Echo. But he came to me because he felt like I had resource for him. So that is what I mean by felt resource. I'm not talking about financial resources. I wouldn't mind feeling financial resource once in a while myself, but I get by. And I certainly get by a lot better in a way than somebody that's got two Lamborghinis and 3 houses and is filled with deep anxiety. So, and it isn't really the deep anxiety that's the issue, it's that he has got no place to go to feel resourced. That's the issue. We all can feel anxiety. But the question is, can we feel resourced even as we feel anxiety? And that's why I said, we're going to break and then we'll have one more time for conversation. But that is why I said, whatever it was that I said. I'm really starting to lose my marbles upstairs. Doesn't bother me, but other people it can bother. But that is why we want to, this path. Hasranat Khan said, you see these dervishes, they wear rags for their sleeves, but underneath that are arms of emperors. Now, I shouldn't tell that story because a lot of Sufis feel like they need to walk around in rags. Whether you're in rags or you have a Lamborghini, it's immaterial. You can enjoy either one. You can enjoy your rags or you can enjoy your Lamborghinis. That's a whole nother discussion. And you can still be a Sufi. So I'm not suggesting that we all walk around in rags. But whatever you are, may you have a place of felt refuge. So let's take a break. We get back together again in 3:45. Right? What are we doing for this break? I don't remember. When do we get back here? 3:30?
Some tea and snacks.
Tea and snacks for how long? I lost time.
About half an hour.
Half an hour.
So we
What-
come back at 3:30.
3:30.